Great. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Philip Coggan, the Buttonwood Columnist of The Economist, and we're here to have a session called, optimistically, Rule Britannia. How can the UK realise its growth potential in the global economy? Having just popped over to the popular session next door, where 5 out of 6 of groups of voters that they've analysed have decided that Britain is in long-term decline. Rule Britannia might seem a bit optimistic, and they also found that most people didn't really believe there was a recovery, so that's something that we might want to discuss among the panel of to what extent the official statistics on recovery reflect the general mood in the economy and how we can connect the two together. We have a distinguished panel who are each going to speak to 5 to 7 minutes, and I will try and keep them to time so that you have a chance to have questions afterwards. On my left, not necessarily politically, Michael Fallon, the Minister of State for Business, Innovation and Skills. On his left, David Sproul, who's the Senior Partner and Chief Executive of Deloitte. On my right, I'm delighted to welcome an old friend, Gerard Lyons, who is now the Economic Advisor to Boris Johnson, which must result in some interesting meetings. And then on his right, Matthew Oakley, who's the Head of Economics and Social Policy at Policy Exchange. And I'd like to invite Michael Fallon to kick things off. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you for the invitation. I think this is a timely debate. I've just come, as I think some of you have, from the economy session of the conference, which focused on the unprecedented competitive challenge that we face. And what I like about the title today, and what's so important that we need to discuss, is the nature of that challenge. Developing countries are competing higher and higher up the value chain, threatening our comparative advantage, and we need to respond to that. The fastest growing economies since we came to power in May 2010 are Indonesia, Chile, Argentina, Turkey and Estonia. The economies with the largest increase in real GDP over that same 3.5-year period were the United States, India, Russia, China and Mexico. So we need to be benchmarking our performance against countries like that. And I want to focus today on how we measure up against those competitors, what we're doing to create a pro-business environment, and finally how we translate success at home in the domestic market into sales abroad. First, how do we measure up against the competition? We've sent out, right from the beginning, an unambiguous message that Britain is very much open for business. The World Bank put us second in Europe in terms of ease of doing business. In a world of mobile capital, tax rates matter. We're cutting corporation tax, as you know, down to 20%, the lowest in the G20. That's lower than the rate in China, lower than the rate in India, in Brazil, in Indonesia. We've also done difficult things politically. We've cut the top rate of tax precisely because a 50p rate sent a message that the UK was penalising success. And that's why I thought Labour's conference last week was so revealing. Somebody who wants to be Prime Minister proposing higher taxes on business, wage controls, confiscation of private property, and a highly irresponsible and ill-thought-out plan to freeze energy prices. The message from Labour was surely that the UK would be closed to business and closed to wealth creation. Now, despite the challenging economic environment over the last 2 or 3 years, in the UK we remain in the European Union a primary location for new inward investment. And our aim is to become the leading destination for investment from emerging markets. The Olympics and the Great Campaign showed the world that we have the business opportunities here, we have the skills here, we have a business-friendly workforce that will help investors thrive. But that's a successful Olympics, an attractive corporation tax rate, that's just the start. Business decisions that derive from global mandates increasingly reflect a long-term view of a country's prospects. So how do we become more competitive? The Thatcher years showed us that supply chain decisions, supply side decisions, improve the long-term effectiveness of the economy. That's not glamorous stuff, but it's necessary. We need open markets, we need to open up markets to more competition. 4 banks control 85% of business lending. But in food retailing, there's a strong second tier beneath the major supermarkets. In banking, there isn't. In energy, we have the big 6. We don't yet have a sufficiently competitive, independent sector to challenge them. That's why we champion in our policies challenger businesses, innovative providers. Second, we need to address the chronic skills shortage. A huge barrier to growth in this country is a lack of suitably skilled workers in industries such as engineering in particular. That's why we're putting employers now in charge of ensuring we have the skills we need. And finally, regulation. We've saved business almost £1 billion in red tape costs. That's been copied across Europe. The French now have a one-in, one-out system like we do. So do the Spanish and the Italians. Our moratorium for regulation of micro businesses, I announced today, is being extended to cover all SMEs. But I want to be more ambitious than that. I want to explore whether new companies shouldn't be exempt from having to comply with any regulation other than the basic safety regulation when they first set up, or whether a better enforcement approach would help new companies to grow. And we also need to increase labour market flexibility to tackle youth unemployment. We've created 1.4 million jobs since 2010, but our youth unemployment rate is twice that of Germany. That gap owes much to the vigorous supply-side reforms in Germany of a decade ago, and we need to be looking now here at more radical options to make it easier to hire people. And finally, in our trade performance, we need a step change. Only 1 in 5 of our small firms export. If we turn that into 1 in 4, we wouldn't have a trade deficit. While the EU is still our largest export market, non-EU markets are where the growth is. Between 2010, when we started, and 2012, last year, exports to the BRICS rose by 30%, exports to the Eurozone by only 5%. We have one of the worst trade balances in the G20. Germany exports 6 times as much as we do to China. So we have our aim of doubling exports to £1 trillion sterling, and to see 100,000 more businesses exporting. And finally, very finally, because I think you're looking at your watch, very finally, we need reform in Europe. Europe is 25% of the world's GDP, as Chancellor Merkel put it so brilliantly, but is carrying 50% of global social spending on benefits, on healthcare, on pensions. That is unsustainable if our children are to have jobs in the future. Too much of the single market remains incomplete in energy, in telecommunications, in services, but we also need to look at European regulation across the board, and we'll be publishing very soon the recommendations of the business task force that the Prime Minister asked me to chair as to the European regulations that need to be swept away. In conclusion, we are recovering. We're recovering from the worst economic crash in our history. We've created 1.4 million new jobs. We've got the highest number of new companies since records began. But none of that, necessary as it is sufficient. Nobody out there, least of all on the Pacific Rim, owes this country a living. If we're going to be successful globally, then first we must ensure that we are more competitive here at home.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question. Fallon Consulting calculated a couple of weeks ago that 1 in 4 net new jobs was in property, not in construction, but generally in property, and that there were more estate agents in the country than ever before. Can we get rich as a country by buying and selling each other houses? And does the recreation of an effective Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac guarantee scheme for mortgages help the rebalancing of the recovery that we need to see into exports and away from the kind of debt-financed housing model that brought us into ruin 5 or 6 years ago?
What we know is that we can't build a recovery on the cocktail of ever-increasing public spending, rising house prices, and overemphasis on financial services. Those three together are not sufficient for a modern economy. We have to go back and look at the skills we need and to harness the technologies which are there in our universities and send those technologies out to earn our core across the world. And we are identifying those technologies, and in some of the industries we are going back now to increasing our share of manufacturing. We see our leadership now in aerospace, we're the second best in the world, in auto, where we're actually selling more cars by value than we to export than we import. The Nissan car plant in Sunderland made more cars last year than the whole of the Italian car industry, just one plant. We are part of the Airbus success story. Our universities are developing in these new technologies that David Willett speaks about, world-beating skills that we can send around the world. So we are addressing that balance. Are we heading for a housing boom? Your reference to Fannie Mae? No. We have the Financial Policy Committee that's going to check the state of the housing finance market.
How would you do that?
It does that. It's going to do that every year. I'm going to report specifically to the Chancellor on that. But you heard the Chancellor today speak very specifically about those who are lucky enough to live in central London, telling the rest of the country they can't get on the housing ladder. There isn't a housing boom outside central London. It is incredibly hard for young people to raise that 20% deposit, and that's the purpose of the home help scheme that we've announced today.
Okay, David.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for those opening comments. I'm going to pick up maybe one element of Michael's comments and just spend a few minutes on that, which is the role of the UK as a global exporter. We're at a point in our economy where business, I think, recognises the role it has to play as the Minister outlined, in terms of helping push the economy forward. We're at a point where all the surveys will tell us that business is now more confident. Our own survey out today shows business confidence at a 5-year high, and CFOs at a point where they're ready to move to more expansionary policies rather than cost control and cash control. So we are at that point where business has a big role to play, and one of the critical areas is for business to recognise its role in creating exports. If you look at some of the data, the trends in global exports are encouraging for the UK. As Michael already said, the pace of exports has increased significantly. We estimate that if you look at the FTSE 350 companies, over 55% of their revenues already come from overseas. And with growth in the UK difficult, then the need for business to focus on where those markets give opportunities for growth is increasingly important. UK business is confident about that opportunity to grow internationally. In a recent survey that, again, we were involved in, over 50% of business surveyed said they'd expect to see more than half their revenue growth in the next 5-10 years coming overseas. But we do need to recognise that the UK has underperformed in exports over the last decade. The share of UK global export markets has declined from 5.3% to 3.7% global exports over that decade, with the majority of our exports still going to the mature markets. So the challenge for us as UK business on that export piece that Michael referred to is playing a bigger role in emerging markets, developing markets. Now, whilst we can be highly critical of our performance, one needs to recognise that if one looks at markets like China, Indonesia, that was just mentioned, Brazil, where other countries have been strong exporters, of course, they've been exporting the things they make, infrastructure, trains, and heavy engineering. And of course, those aren't areas where we are necessarily market leaders. But if you look at the emerging markets, as we see increasing urbanisation, the number of population, 10 million population cities in China is growing exponentially. We see an increasing middle class, an increasing sophistication of those markets. Then actually we're moving into a point where what the UK does well, which is services, technology-led manufacturing, actually is a sweet spot for the future. So there's a real opportunity for us in the UK to take some of the things we're already world leaders at and take that to those emerging markets. And therefore one of our rallying calls in support of what's just been said is let's look at what we do well and shift that focus to the emerging markets there. So the opportunity is there, the opportunity for business to grasp that opportunity is clear, and I think the things that need to happen are 3 or 4 things really. One is a very clear focus in supporting business to pursue those opportunities. Much of this will come from medium and small sized businesses, not just large business. If you look at one of the success stories in China is actually Arabs, the architectural firm, who of course are behind most of the airports that have been built in China in terms of the design. And one of the things that Philip Dilley, the chairman, says there, which goes to the point about getting on the ground, is that the best way to win work in China today is to go back 20 years and start building relationships. Now, of course, we can't all do that, but it goes to the power of getting on the ground in relationships. So the first thing is business has to get on the ground, and we need to help business work out how to have people on the ground in those emerging markets. The second thing is that they need language skills. One of the things that comes through very clearly is that business is not confident about going to those markets without some language skills, and therefore supporting language skills right through the education system, but importantly business at this stage is important. And thirdly, supporting going to those simple things like trade fairs, making connections, which I do think UKTI and the Foreign Office have started doing in terms of creating that support in those foreign markets, and we need to see more of that. But the core issue is the opportunity is there for UK business to play a bigger role as those emerging markets become more sophisticated, growing middle class, and increasing urbanisation, and that's what we should get behind.
Thank you. You survey CFOs, but there'll be a lot of small companies that won't have anybody called a CFO.
Yeah.
And those of us who are up and listening to Wake Up to Money at 5:30 this morning will have heard the British Chambers of Commerce saying big companies can get loans from the banks.
Yeah.
People can get mortgages from the banks. That's what funding for lending has boosted. But small companies still struggle to get funding for lending. When you survey companies, do you get a sense of that continuing divide?
There clearly is a divide. I mean, I don't think it's as stark as you portrayed, Philip, but there is a divide. There's no question that large business finds cash, credit not a problem at all. Small business still finds that it creates uncertainty. So there is still more to be done in making small business have easier access to funding, no question.
Gerard.
Thank you. Good morning, or good afternoon rather. Pleasure to be here. I'd like to focus on 3 issues from a global perspective, a regional perspective, and then nationally, very much reinforcing some of the points said before. First, globally, I think it's important to stress that in terms of how the UK can position itself in the changing global economy at the time of this talk, first of all, we need to really be aware of the prize on offer. The last 5 years have shown a very divided global economy, a very disconnected global economy, divided east versus west, core of Europe versus periphery, very disconnected. Michael touched on youth unemployment, almost 1 million NEETs here in the UK, not in employment, education and training, very much a Western phenomena, but also an African phenomena. And as a result, policy dilemmas are very apparent globally, with politicians playing to the gallery, very much, even here in the UK, taking short-term measures rather than thinking longer term all the time. But despite all that, the key issue is the global economy is really, really, really growing. Take 3 numbers, 32, 62, 72. Only 3 numbers I'm going to use. $32 trillion was the size of the world economy beginning of this century. $62 trillion was the size of the world economy 5 years ago last weekend, the weekend Lehman Brothers went belly up. $72 trillion was the size of the world economy at the end of last year. Nominal figures, some inflation, but the vast bulk real economic activity. Michael touched on at the beginning the growing economies. The world economy basically looks set for probably its best period of global economic growth the next 20-25 years since post-Second World War. If you take the last 200 years together, this will probably be the 3rd period of real strong economic expansion. But in the West, we seem to be still taking a far too pessimistic short-term view. So very much the key issue is about repositioning Britain in that growing global economy. Second big issue is our relationship with Europe. Should we be in or should we be out? Basically, it very much depends on whether you view Europe as a castle or a prison. If you view it as a prison where their regulations will keep you in, difficult to escape, then we should be out. If you view it as a castle, a beacon of strength in the growing global economy, then we should be in. We somewhat kill ourselves that we can force Europe to reform by ourselves. But the good news is that there are other countries on the continent, Germany, Sweden included, who seem prepared to reform. But regardless of what Europe decides to do, there are some big positives. Immigration. Lots of people at this conference always seem to think immigration is a bad thing. Immigration is a very, very good thing if you plan for it. But it's important to bear in mind that Britain is set to become the most populated country in Europe in the next 40 years based on our government's projections. On medium expectations, in 40 years' time, our population will be 83, 84 million, can't remember the exact figure. The upper trajectory, which I think is more realistic, is 97 million. It's a demographic disaster if we don't plan for it. It's a demographic dividend if we do plan for it. And the other point on regionally, if we look at the European Union's latest survey of regions across Europe, 3 of the top 10 regions in Europe were in Britain. 2 of them were not dependent on a city as such. The only 2 regions out of the 10 that wasn't dependent on the city. But when you see these regions, you'll think indirectly they're very dependent on the city. Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire was one of the top 5 regions in Europe. Surrey, West and East Sussex, another. And of course, the second most important region in Europe was London. Basically, regardless of our relationship with Europe, as long as we do the next things that I'm about to talk about right, then I think we should be very positive. And that comes on to the national aspect, global, regional, national. And it's very much reinforcing what David has just said and also what Michael very much said at the start. But rather than repeat what they've said, let me just add a few other things. I listened to the Chancellor this morning. He made some very good comments. The positives, I thought, was his commitment to a budget surplus and to infrastructure spending in 4 or 5 years' time. He did say that we're very positive here in the UK. I would actually say our biggest export is our pessimism. British people are far more pessimistic than anyone. Probably the Indians might be the only exception. We're doing lots of good things well. Lord Green, with his boost to exports via SMEs, very much we need to take time to see that come through. The supply side changes that Michael's touched on. Also, we haven't really dwelt on here the macroeconomic changes, particularly the new measures at the Bank of England, macroprudential measures. But that being said, I thought Philip's questions touched on the key issue. We kid ourselves, really, if we think the solution to the economy is the fascination we have with being on the housing ladder. Britain's biggest problem is this obsession with housing. In Germany, the best economy in Europe, house prices have not gone up for the last 12 years. They do not jump up and down when they think house prices have gone through the roof. Remember 20 years ago, the head of the Bundesbank turned up at a big seminar in the city, and the headlines that morning, Express and the Telegraph and all the papers were house prices up. He said, held up one of the papers and said, if we had this in Germany, we would view it as a big economic problem. And it is. Over-reliance on finance, big problem. We might make the city safe, but when you look at the city in relation to the European economy, it's not big. When you look at the city in relation to the UK economy, it's very sizable. Hence, former Governor Mervyn King's comments that international banks are international in life, but national in death, is still an important issue. We had a banking crisis, not a financial crisis, and we still haven't fixed the banks. The other point is reforming the public sector. We've gone a bit quiet on that in recent years. It's quality of government spending, not just quantity. Quantity is important to control, but the public sector does have an important role to play. What does that mean? Just a few things, very much reiterating what is being or has been said already. I think on the supply side, this government is doing a phenomenal amount of good things. Enabling the private sector is the best that can be done. The comments on taxation and regulation, I think we should all approve. And so it's difficult to add to that. On the other side, though, strategically from a government perspective, as the Olympics showed, the public sector and the private sector working together can achieve a lot, provided they work in the right areas where there's market failure, or where the private sector doesn't take the initiative. And infrastructure, our infrastructure is pretty abysmal. The one thing I would be suggesting the Chancellor does over and above what he's already done, which is very good, is I do think we should be borrowing more to invest in the infrastructure. Building a new airport is an easy thing, that could actually be privately financed. But basically we need to be investing more to enable the private sector to continue to grow. So given the 20 seconds left, the 3 messages on that side is vision. We do need a clear vision. We don't always have a longer term vision. And that group you were talking about down the corridor the populist group seem to want a vision. We need to have patience, but we do need to invest. Overall, I think we're on the right tracks, and we should be very positive when we look globally, regionally, and nationally. Thank you.
Thank you. Just quick follow-up questions with your Economist hat on. 5 years after a big fall in sterling and after the UK economy has been bumbling along, we're still running a current account deficit. That isn't what should happen in theory. Was there a structural problem I wanted to ask about? And then coming from London with the very high house prices and domination of finance, I was looking at the data. So in the 1970s, the population of Britain rose 500,000. We built just over 2.5 million homes. In the last decade, we built 1.7 million homes, and the population of Britain went up 3.5 million. If we're talking about infrastructure, if you can't house people and that forces prices up, isn't that the one big thing that a government should be doing, as Harold Macmillan famously did as a Conservative housing minister 50, 60 years ago?
Yeah, on the two issues, current account deficit. Yeah, Britain started to run into a trade deficit in the late 80s. Chancellor Lawson then said the trade deficit didn't matter. He was proved to be wrong. And having the big trade deficit and the big current account deficit means that an economy is very dependent on foreign money. Obviously, it depends what your current account deficit is there for. If it was a case, as in the Lawson boom, to fund the consumer boom, then it was a bad thing. But actually, what we're seeing now, and we see this in London, a lot of the money coming into the UK, coming into London, is, as Michael touched on earlier, is basically investment because foreigners see opportunities here in the UK. Take the airport that the Mayor has proposed in the Docklands. I was going to say, sorry, lots of people have their own views on that, won't go there, but if we, on the north side of the estuary, opened this year is London's first deep water port for 50 years, funded not by any public sector money. The public sector didn't want to take the initiative. P&O, who used to be the company that owned the port, didn't want to take the initiative. But DP World, a Dubai-based company, UAE-based, has invested over £1.5 billion in the UK because they see the UK as having a big opportunity. So I think the current account deficit is a concern, but you do need to break it down as to what is driving the money coming in. And we're actually seeing good quality money coming in to invest for the future. But also the other point to bear in mind is that while we keep talking about exports, David at the earlier point talked about his survey saying that Britain is well positioned now in terms of services. Many companies don't export from the UK, and the same is now being seen in German companies. They're doing what the Brits did many years ago. We base ourselves overseas. If you're exporting to China, after a while you think, well, you don't actually need to be exporting from Britain. You start to invest in China and you repatriate the dividends and profits back to the UK. So it's a different dynamic. The other point on housing, yes. I think we do need to have a big housing supply situation. There's two types of migration you see into London. One is international migration, and the other big migration we shouldn't kid ourselves about is migration within the UK. Younger people from other parts of the country are migrating to London, because it's more exciting maybe, they're looking for opportunities. And rents are going through the roof. There is a big problem. Now, the Bank of England doesn't view house prices in London as their responsibility. Why should they? Rents going up is a byproduct of that as well. What we do need to do is, as Philip touched on, is recognise that in the 1930s and also in the 1960s, there was massive construction of properties in the UK. And that was basically because finance was available and because supply constraints were removed. We've seen some of that now, but there's a NIMBYism in the UK. We don't want properties in people's backyards. But basically, you're right, we do need to have a supply-side revolution in terms of construction. But this is not this government's problem. This is a 40-year issue. And it comes back to the whole endemic issue that British people like to see property prices go up.
Matthew.
Thank you very much. I'm an optimist. I'm going to start off being optimistic. I think it's actually really good to be having this debate. I've spent the last 3 years at Policy Exchange arguing that this is the debate we should be having rather than squabbling about the debt and the deficit and who's right on the left or the right. So we've had this event now the last 3 weeks at Labour, Lib Dem and our Conservative conference, and really encouraging. I don't think we've once talked about whether we should be spending more or spending less. It's all been about the long term and what we can do to make the most of the global changes that are happening in the economy. So that's, I think, a really positive thing, and that's where I'm going to focus and look to, as everyone else has stored on my handy kind of facts and figures and data points. I'm going to ignore those and go straight to kind of where I see the major challenges and choices for the government and for the opposition parties running up to the 2015 election, and think about how we can change domestic policy in order to make the most of the global economy. In some respects, and this has been said already, some of the we're actually in a good place, I think, in that there's going to be a huge increase in the middle classes across the globe in the coming years. I think one of the speakers last week talked about kind of 5 billion people in the middle classes over the next 10 years. So, you know, as soon as those people start growing, because more middle classes, they're going to want to start consuming more education, more health, more of the kind of things that Britain is good at and starting to export more of already. So I think we're already in a good place, and you know, I think we can take advantage of those things and make the most of them. That's where I kind of stopped being optimistic, actually. And I think the rest of what I'm going to say... I know, sorry. Well, I was going to talk about good data, but everyone's too used to it already. So I think there's some real political challenges around the policy, which I think is going to be needed to make sure we make the most of long-term trends and really turn the economy around to make sure we have a sustainable and long-term growth. I think I have probably 6, maybe 7 areas there. I'll go for 6 to start with. The first of all, I really think that our labour market is still quite broken. Before the recession, we had something like 4 million workless people in the economy. We've still got 50% of people leaving school at 16 without 580C GCSEs, including English and Maths. Before the recession, our productivity was lagging our main competitors. Now we're talking about being something like 40,000 places short in terms of engineers in the economy. So we're just not providing the kind of skills and the kind of workforce that the economy needs to grow. And I think that's a huge problem. I think some good things laid out today in the welfare reform side, but I think much more needs to be done to make sure we have the right skills and the right kind of education system to really be competitive in the global market. The problem is that's a long-term solution. You know, creating 40,000 engineers or 180,000 shortage, I think it was in technicians I was hearing earlier. That's a long-term solution. So what we need is a short-term solution. And here there's a huge problem with immigration and the approach that the current government and indeed the previous government had to immigration. Having a cap on immigration, I think, is hugely damaging to business and the opportunities for business to bring in the best and the brightest people. You know, Michael was talking about being open to the, you know, Britain being open to the global economy. We need the best and the brightest people here, and that has to be about having a sensible immigration policy where business can bring in the people they need. So that's the second area, immigration. The third area is, I guess, informed by 8 years working at the Treasury and having to make up policy overnight whenever there was a bad kind of press headline. And there's a huge problem here, and it was evident during the kind of Labour administration, and less so, I think, actually, since the coalition had come to power. But it's this kind of policy by announcement, which kind of keeps repeating kind of new policy ideas every week, and that's hugely damaging to business. People here in business will know that decisions are made over 5, 10, 15, 20 years in terms of investment. And if in that 15, 20 years you've got 40 changes to tax legislation, 100 changes in different kind of regulations, and that's hugely damaging to the certainty that that is needed to actually make those decisions. So what I'd like to see is a much more longer term plan in those areas around tax, around planning and around regulation. The fourth area is around planning and infrastructure. Others have talked already. A huge political issue. You know, Gerard talked about the 97 million people in the UK. We clearly need to build more houses. Clearly need to build more houses. And then we need to start having a much more sensible discussion around, you know, expansion of Heathrow or expansion of hub airports in the southeast or in Birmingham or Manchester. We also need to talk more sensibly about HS2. And once those decisions have been made, we need to do it. Now, it's ridiculous that we're delivering projects in 20 or 30 years that could be delivered much more quickly, much more cheaply in other countries. Fifthly, energy policy. You only need to look at the USA to see how much of an impact that has had recently. You know, they've got a booming manufacturing sector which is really driving their economy. Frankly, last week's party conference was a little bit frightening / scary / disturbing to see who's actually advising him on the economy. But you know, I don't think actually this government's doing an awful lot better often on the energy side, and so we actually need again a longer term plan. Finally, the sixth area, and this is I guess the biggie. It's around debt. Before the recession, we're talking about 400% of GDP as debt in the household and government sector. We've got an economy which is driven by consumption, by our credit cards, and we need to start moving that much more towards investment rather than consumption. That is going to take a huge change in how we all live our lives, which I think is going to be really, really difficult. And that kind of leads me into, I guess a point that all those areas are quite kind of, I see them as quite easy kind of policy areas. They're quite kind of obvious Tory answers. There's some good economists in the room, some good economists in government. There seems to be some obvious things to try and tackle those issues. The problem is that actually a lot of the solutions aren't particularly attractive to the voting public. Immigration, obviously there's fears around people coming to Britain taking our jobs. Obviously NIMBYs are a problem on housing. There's all sorts of problems which stand in the way of us actually putting in place the policies which are needed. So alongside this kind of policy on growth on the economy, I think we also need to have a much stronger narrative on living standards. If people's living standards are increasing, if people's incomes are rising, then I think actually they'll be much more supportive of the changes that need to happen in the economy. So that's about talking about the minimum wage, it's about talking about tax, it's about talking about skills and family. And it's having that kind of strength in that area as well, which will really allow us to start talking more ambitiously about how to change the economy side of things, which I think are really needed. So I think that's a huge challenge to politicians in 2015, is how to tackle those huge structural issues in the economy, the labour market, immigration, skills, but also how to put forward a real comprehensive and a thorough plan on living standards, making sure that everyone across the country is really enjoying kind of growth and increase in living standards.
Thank you. I just want to come back to Tyler Cowen. I don't know if you looked at his theories that says that we'll have this, you're talking about sort of globalised world, and so is the Minister, we need to be competitive, but he sees that world divided into an elite which is well educated, can compete, moves between London, New York and all the rest of it, and then the vast rest of the population which doesn't get much benefit out of it. Is that a feasible long-term plan for an economy in a democracy? So you've seen in Europe, you've got sort of 25 to 30% of voters who are willing to vote for Syriza and Golden Dawn in Greece, or Beppe Grillo in Italy, or National Front of Communists in France, or UKIP here. Can you carry on? Can you for 10 or 20 years have that situation, promote that situation, and not be brought low by the voters?
So I don't think so. No, I think this is what I'm saying about making sure that everyone's really taking part in the economy. Everyone is seeing increasing living standards. I guess the base of this kind of argument is the hollowing out of the labour market kind of idea that there's no jobs in the middle anymore. I don't really agree with that necessarily. I think that's just a consequence of technological change and globalisation. And what we'll see actually is a whole new middle set of jobs being created somewhere else effectively. What needs to happen to make sure that that kind of vision is a reality is that we need to sort out the skills system and make sure that people in schools are doing the right kind of education so they can actually move into those areas. Talking about coding, talking about engineering, all those kind of skills which actually people aren't taking on at the moment. And so it's kind of has to start in schools. Admittedly, there's an issue I think in the current generation where the jobs that they might expect to be in aren't there anymore. And so there's a question there about how the welfare state deals with that, which again I think is being laid out quite effectively.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open it up to questions. If you could say who you are as well. The gentleman, very quick up there.
Angel Pangan from the Conservatives Abroad in Beijing. I wanted to ask a question that I think David mentioned. I think we all are very optimistic about where Britain's position for the services cycle in the emerging markets, but I guess the problem is that history shows, generally speaking, that whilst manufacturing sectors can make almost universal inroads into emerging markets, the services sectors have found it much more difficult. So if you look at Japan or Korea, even after so many decades, British banks and so on aren't really in there. So what makes you think actually that the services sector can stand to benefit from the emerging markets? I guess that's the general
Yeah.
question.
Well, I think there's two things that are different. The first is I think there's a realism that just taking what you do here and trying to replicate that in the foreign market isn't going to work. So those that are being successful are recognising they have to operate in a different way. There's no point just picking up what works in London or Birmingham or Manchester and saying we'll apply that in China. So I think there is a recognition that creating a different sort of ecosystem in those markets will be necessary. I think that probably wasn't recognised as businesses try to expand into Japan. The same thing is I think one has to recognise that the ability to continually be successful in manufacturing is far more challenged than the services sector. You don't just look at what we've seen over the last 20 years with low-cost manufacturing. You look at how technology is changing manufacturing and how we're going to be continually at a point of having to chase technological advances. I mean, everyone's heard about 3D printers. I mean, I was giving a demonstration last week of a 3D printer, which I don't know other people in the room might not have heard of 3D printing until 2 years ago, but I was showing one that costs $1,500 and prints itself. So this 3D printer will print another 3D printer, and it costs $1,500. Now, there's a bit of gadgetry there, but you think about the impact that pace of technological change is going to have on manufacturing. So I think we need to recognise that the services sector will be something that we are world leaders in, and we need to build on that. But recognising that those cultural differences and building something different, an ecosystem in those markets, will be key.
Not much to add to that. I mean, I wouldn't be quite as gloomy about services. I think services in this country, professional services in particular, are grounded in the rule of law, are respected the world over. I have no difficulty abroad when I'm on trade missions or whatever in speaking and advocating our professional services, and further down in things like project management and some of the financial expertise that we have in these projects. I think the other answer is, of course, we've got to continue to open up some of the more difficult markets like Japan and Korea, but there's not yet the liberalisation in those markets that we see elsewhere in the world, and that's why I think the trade agreements and the work that's now being done at the European level is important, not just for industry and for tariffs, but for these more surreptitious non-tariff barriers as well.
Gerard, you travelled the world, talked to clients. I was at a conference last year, and somebody said that the Chinese had described Europe as just a giant theme park where they wanted to come and see, the sights, where the horses in the land. Is that your impression of how people see Britain?
Yeah, well, the Home Secretary is now going to make it easier for Chinese people to come and see the sites in Britain as well. That's good as well. But actually, in the earlier point, I think it was Michael who mentioned the German data that Germany has 25% of the world's GDP, 50% of its population, has 50% of its welfare spending. It only has 7% of its population. You do have a big challenge in terms of Europe, aging population. Hence, it's important for the UK to not only cooperate with Europe, but I think it's important that we do differentiate ourselves from Europe in many key areas, population, welfare being aspects of it. But coming back to your point, the Chinese are very much into a multipolar global economy, which is Europe standing on its own 2 feet. I spoke in, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, I remember speaking in the Great Hall of the People on the EU-China annual thing, and the UK was president of it. And the reason for mentioning it is a Chinese minister stood up after, and he said, my words, not his, but basically the gist of it was they couldn't get their head around Europe. Europe came as part of the EU, and then every European country came by itself. And at one level Europe was cooperating, at another level Europe was competing. And he was making the point, we understand the Chinese America better, because America comes as one, has a strategic and economic dialogue. And indeed, President Obama in the last 18 months has said that America is a Pacific economy, and he's a Pacific president, I think is the phrase he's used. So America is very much focusing on the growth markets, Asia Pacific. So I don't think we should just view Europe as a theme park. But the final point to mention, on the record as well as off the record last year, the Chinese Commerce Minister said that he described continental Europe as having a Cold War approach to Chinese investment. Europe didn't want Chinese investment in any key area as far as the Chinese were concerned. In contrast, he said that Britain was the only open economy within Europe. And as part of the Olympics a couple of years ago, or last year, the Prime Minister invited over the Chinese Entrepreneurs Club, who owns 7 to 8% of the Chinese economy. And at the end of their 3-day trip, they summarised saying they didn't realise, and this is hard to believe, they didn't realise how open an economy Britain was until they had finished their trip here. So I think Britain needs to play with Europe on the same level when it suits us, but at the same time I do think we should differentiate ourselves, and Asia and China are very different and difficult markets.
Thank you. Matthew?
Nothing to add to it.
Okay. Next question is the gentleman in the front.
Thank you. Philip Ozer from the Government of Jersey. A recent independent report from Capital Economics showed the strong relationship between Jersey and the UK, supporting about 180,000 jobs and channeling about 5% of inward foreign capital investment into the UK. Much of that is because we collect assets from around the world and invest them into the UK as opposed to other countries. I'd be interested to hear the panel's view about how the UK might be able to work better with the, if I may say, Britannia satellite economies, such as Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man in the future.
I think that's one for you straight away, Minister.
Yes, I mean, you know, how do we work? How do we work better? I think first of all we need to be welcoming to what's happening in Jersey and Guernsey and the Isle of Man. Are, to my mind, a key part of our financial service strength, and I think we need to accept that and not use emotive language when we describe some of these lower tax regimes. They are ways of sucking in more investment into the UK, and we need to work more closely with them. I'm not aware that there are huge problems here. I know there are issues for Jersey and Guernsey having to replicate some of the financial service legislation from the EU. I'd certainly like to see Jersey and Guernsey work more closely together with each other. I think that's now beginning to happen. I've been reading some of those age-old rivalries are being set aside. But I think we ought to start by recognising Isle of Man, Jersey and Guernsey as a big and important part of our financial economy as one whole.
No, I'd probably echo that. If one looks at the the asset management sector in Europe generally, looks at the competition between Luxembourg, Dublin, and Guernsey and Jersey. Guernsey and Jersey, sorry. Channel Islands. Clearly, it's in our interest to try and ensure that your position is put forward, and definitely the environment has changed, and what goes on in Luxembourg, Dublin, Channel Islands is looked at through a different lens than it would have been looked at a few years ago. And I think the challenge is for your government and the UK government to make sure we're responding to that. And making a case on the back of the asset management skills, not on the back of what will be perceived as a low tax rate.
Gentleman in the second row there.
Hi, my name is Carl Belazer from Unlimited, which is a foundation for social entrepreneurs. And as we're talking about long-term sustainable solutions and capitalising upon UK's leading industries, PM recently recognised at the G8 the UK leads the way in social innovation and social investment models. So I wanted to sort of ask the panel really, considering RBS recently published that 20% of all startups have a social focus, what you feel, what business policies are needed really to nurture social businesses to thrive and put people and planet alongside profits?
I'm going to pass it on to Matthew.
And I'm going to cheat and throw it straight back at you and say, what do you think?
Ooh.
Well, what do I think? I think that personally that social entrepreneurship should be considered in addition to business focus outside of just the Cabinet Office's realms, and should be incorporated into the core policies. I appreciate that often it's overlooked that actually social entrepreneurs are viewed as private businesses. However, a lot of the language and the engagement with the sector and the opportunity really to export some of our models here across the UK could absolutely be advantageous to business core business policies, hence why I thought I'd throw the question up to the panel.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah, I think you're asking about the structure of government. I mean, as I understand it, social enterprise has come in from the gold. It's come into the Cabinet Office, and we have a whole range of policies there to promote social enterprise and to ensure that some of the funding streams that are available to normal enterprise do get through to social enterprise. I'm looking at that particularly in the context of European funds to make sure they do get all the way there. But I think what you're really asking me is in time we move them on from the Cabinet Office and made them absolutely central to the business department. That's nobody's ever put that to me before, and it's certainly something I'd like to think about.
Gerard.
Yeah, I've not really thought about this before, but it's partly because it's a very difficult area to quantify. It's in qualitative terms, but it's interesting speaking to a couple of companies last year, actually, more so before I took up this role. One of the big questions in this recovery has been why big companies who've got a phenomenal amount of money have not taken the initiative to invest. And I always tended to think they always lag recoveries. They wait for the government, they wait for consumers to start spending. But what's interesting is when you speak to some of the big companies, they're now talking more about the stuff that you're mentioning. It's not about becoming bigger, partly because of what happened last week. They don't want to put their head above water too much to be shot down by policies that hit big companies that make too much money. But it's more about becoming good companies, and it's, as opposed to a nice to have, a sort of wishy-washy woolly sort of thing, it's becoming a sort of more integral. So it's becoming a big area. My concern would be if it became at the expense of companies making money, and if it became at the expense of companies actually competing globally. But I think if it becomes a core part, then it's a positive thing, and if we can export it as well, and that's good.
Just a quick additional point. I mean, I think the question is a great question. I'm not sure it's about policy as opposed to practice, because certainly what we see is one of the biggest challenges for social enterprise is sort of getting into the supply chain of big businesses and the economy at large, and therefore it's almost a challenge for big business. And it really goes to Gerard's point, how does big business work with social enterprise to help them be successful? Because certainly in our experience, it's less about policy, it's more about practicalities. And definitely, although the numbers are small, I mean, the employment numbers in social enterprise are significant in terms of growth coming through. So we're a big supporter, but it's getting it into the sort of the ecosystem of the economy rather than thinking it's something over here that is just doing good. So I think your point is absolutely right. It's doing good in a way that creates real employment, real opportunity.
Now the questions are queuing up like planes outside Heathrow, so I'm going to two at a time. Lady at the back and then the lady in the middle.
Thank you very much. Anne Cowan from Perth in Scotland. I'm very concerned about energy prices, and I think, if we're going to prosper as a nation, we do have to keep very firm control on this. I'd love to see more and quicker investment in nuclear and fracking, but my real concern is the ludicrous subsidies that are currently being given to wind farms. Not just for the cost of living for everyone of us who pay them, and industry who pays it, but also it's allowing Alex Salmon to pursue his policy of covering the entire Scotland with wind farms, which he's hoping to export at a great expense to the rest of the country once he goes independent.
Right, and the lady there, yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Rebecca Sutter from Peabody, the London housing provider. So it's great to hear so many people talk about the importance of housing as an engine of economic growth. My question is slightly different. I think the Minister emphasised that the London economy is very different from that in the rest of in the rest of the UK. And I was wondering if the panel felt it was now time for a really bold approach to a regional economic policy, really sort of, in a way, obviously, would particularly allow London to thrive. And I think the needs of London are quite different to some areas from the needs of the rest of the
I think, Michael, perhaps you take the energy one. I'm sure your constituents will be very keen on getting rid of the wind farms and getting into fracking trucks.
Sure, I'm well aware of the Scottish angle here. I come from Perth.
I know.
I was born and brought up there. At the moment, a third of all the renewable obligation, a third of the entire subsidy we pay goes to Scotland for renewables. 1/3 goes to 10% of the population. And this is something I've been warning Scotland about. There's no way that Scotland itself, independently, could finance that level of subsidy, let alone finance the decommissioning costs and the exploration that's needed in the final third of the North Sea. So people need to think about that very carefully as to who would actually buy this energy from their wind farms, because at the moment we are subsidising it. And I think we might also have to look very carefully at the two big interconnectors that are proposed from Scotland to England. If Scotland was a separate country, we have a number of interconnector proposals at the moment to do another line to Ireland, to do another one to Norway, another one to France and Belgium and so on, and we'd have to put Scotland in that category as to where we want the interconnectors. So there are some serious thinking to do. Now on the subsidies themselves, we are disgracefully short of energy. We have inherited this legacy of underinvestment, where the last government signed up to all this stuff, all these treaties and commitments and renewables and all the rest of it, many of them binding commitments, but they didn't actually invest in the new generation that's needed. So we are struggling to catch up. And in terms of renewables, which you may not like, we are way behind countries like Germany and Scandinavia and so on. So we are having to catch up. That's why when there is an element of intervention for some of these higher cost newer technologies in renewables, whether it's offshore wind farms or indeed in nuclear. On nuclear, we're losing the nuclear fleet in the late 2020s and 2030s. All these nuclear stations, with the exception of Sizewell, are reaching the end of their life. It's 17-18% of our electricity at the moment. Renewables, by the way, was 15% in the last quarter. We need more energy of all kinds. But we are now urgently restarting our civil nuclear programme. We're in negotiations with EDF. I hope you'll hear soon how we hope to bring those to a conclusion. And we have other stations planned beyond that. On the local economy, if I may, yes, I think Gerard's the man here, but I mean, London is a separate economy, and I think we need to recognise that. I think the answer isn't to go to the regions. It is actually what Michael Heseltine pointed us to. It is more localism, and to tackle this through local enterprise partnerships that do have more control over the government spending that's being spent in these areas, whether it's housing or transport or skills, and can start to shape their own future. We can't have a position where everybody, who does well at school, in wherever it is, Newcastle or Stoke or Perth or whatever, feels they have to come to London to earn a living. That's not acceptable. We have to rebalance our economy.
Gerard, very much agree with what Michael said. I think it's an important issue because last two times I've been on the Radio 4 Today programme to talk about the economy, they turned the question to London versus the rest of the country. They are obsessed by it, and Lord Heseltine is always quoted. And really, I think this debate today should focus our attention on it's the UK versus the rest of the world. I spoke at a school recently, Michael, one in your constituency. Michael's my local MP, so it's good to see my local MP in action today. But I spoke at one of the schools, he does a lot in his constituency. I spoke at one of the schools in his constituency to the sixth form, where, put in perspective, the marks at GCSE were 7 A stars and 3 A's was the average, so it's a pretty good school. And one of the questions was about, if I started my career, was the question, would I go to China? Then we had an interactive discussion. I said to the people in the room, how many of you seriously, I said not just wishy-washy, but seriously would think about going overseas when you finished your degree? And more than 2/3 in the room put their hands up. And basically what came out was that they've been encouraged by their parents to think about it. Now, if we're talking about tops, the reality is, of course, a lot of them won't, but I'm sure a significant number will. And that's the worry, in my mind, that we keep thinking it's London versus the rest, and it's very much Britain versus the rest of the world. In terms of the local finance and localism, I completely agree with Michael. In fact, last week, the Mayor of New York came into City Hall, Mayor Bloomberg. He's financing something for cities out of his own pocket, has to be said. But what was interesting was he was commenting that whereas London keeps only 8% of the revenues it raises, he keeps over 50% in New York. So London is trying to change things in terms of financing, but I think it's a key issue, localism, local financing. But the other thing that at national level we can and should be doing is this whole infrastructure issue. It's about this whole enabling environment. And High Speed 2, we don't want to go there, but the positive aspect about High Speed 2 is what they hope to get at the end, which I always think, why not start there at the beginning, which is getting Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, the northern conurbations all cooperating, working together as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just want to add one very quick thing on the regional stuff, and it's the role of the public sector. And I think for too long we've basically just tried to ship out parts of the public sector to different parts of the country and assume that's going to revive economies. It doesn't work. And the fact that we set pay nationally for the public sector is a real detriment to those economies where they're getting paid too much basically to work in economies which are less strong than London, which means that it squeezes out other parts of the economy. That needs to be addressed.
Yeah. It took me 2 hours and 7 minutes to get here from London this morning, which seems fairly high speed to me. But 50 billion, I'm sure to take 10 minutes off will be very impressive. There's a gentleman there, you want a question, and then a gentleman on the front row, and I think that unless the organisers give us latitude, I might ask the question.
Will McDonald from Aviva, the insurance and pensions company. An appeal and a question. The appeal is that we don't let the debate between SMEs and larger companies get divided. We're obviously a FTSE 100 company, but we're the largest insurer of SMEs. So we like to think we have a role in nurturing other parts of the economy, and I think sometimes the debate can look a bit dichotomous. The question, we're obviously a large infrastructure investor, and the one thing that stops us doing more is governments changing policy, and that is governments, and it has to be across the life cycle of the product that we're looking at, which is 20 to 25 years. So is there any hope for a longer timescale and framework that we can work on?
Yeah, Alex Pratt, I chair one of the local enterprise partnerships down in Buckinghamshire. Building on Gerard's point and Michael's, so much government policy is focused on rebalancing. So everything from focus on the north, even HS2, as we've heard about, is about how do we get the northern economies to work more strongly. Do we think, given that background, that we are investing enough in the successful areas, given our global competitive challenge?
Okay.
Well, on the second one, yes. I mean, it's not London against the rest of the country. I think, one thing policymakers need to do is to look very hard at what makes London so successful. And, a lot of that is a very competitive, open labour market. You go to Canary Wharf now. What Canary Wharf, tells you about social mobility is something the rest of the economy can learn from. The old school tie is gone. You're working for a Frenchman as a Canadian above him, a Lithuanian above him, or whatever. The social structures there, the openness of the London economy, and the speed and flexibility with which it's adapted, I think, are lessons for the rest of the country. So I think that's an important point. On the small versus big, yeah, I was appalled last week to hear this sort of, I think John Cridland put it very well, this kind of balkanisation, this idea that, you help small businesses by beating up on big businesses. We've got to be in favour of business, of all businesses. And, the biggest help that, we can give SMEs, of course, is to make it easier for big businesses to flourish. Sure, they've got to pay on time, they've got to keep to the rules, but, it is those supply chains that are really important. On the longer time frame, everybody would love a longer time frame. People come in and out of my office at the Department of Energy saying, if only we knew how much you were going to spend on energy in 2021 and 2023 and all the way up to 2030. It's very hard for us to commit public spending 2 parliaments ahead. This is a democracy. We can't say how much we're going to spend on power stations 2 elections away. It's simply not possible. We can give indications. We've set out the money to 2020, which gives you some framework. And you heard today the Chancellor linking CapEx, capital expenditure, with GDP growth for the first time. I don't know if you picked up on that, but this is going to be a new rule. So you will be able to see the future increases in capital expenditure linked to the increases in GDP. And that, I hope, will make governments, first of all, spend more on CapEx rather than on current expenditure, because they will have that target to satisfy, but it will also give, I think, industry and investors a slightly longer time frame as well.
Just, on the rebalancing point, I looked at this from a sort of sectoral point of view, and certainly there was a lot of comment in the early stage of government, including from one of Michael's ministerial colleagues, that saw rebalancing as very simply pushing down on financial services and growing manufacturing. And I think that is wrong and far too simplistic. And I'm with you. I think we need to really allow those things we're good at to grow and flourish and be proud of that, and absolutely get rid of the more egregious elements of that. And then on top of that, grow into the new industries. So it's very much around building what we have, and let's celebrate our success, and then building new industries, new sectors on top of that.
Gerard? Yeah, just to reiterate what Michael said, I thought the most important part of the Chancellor's speech was when he said a budget surplus and infrastructure growing at least as much as national income. I think that was a really big issue. And it implies in 2016-17 a real change in the economic dynamic. But the second thing about this long-term vision, I'll give you a real example. I remember about 3 years ago when I was in my office in the city, head 2 people of an international company, they came in and they were talking about how they were moving one of their big regional headquarters to Singapore. And the reason for doing it was that they had been given a commitment by the Singapore authorities of the tax rate they would pay each year for the next 20 years. And they believed them. It was a low tax rate as well. That's the competition we're up against. Singapore obviously is a small economy, that is a very successful one. Others are replicating it. Even though we keep playing to the political short-termism, i.e. we need to get re-elected, the longer-term aspect is really key, that we do need to get in here. And the third thing, the point about the small, medium-sized companies and micro companies as well that Michael touched on earlier, completely agree. Really, I do think we should be fundamentally positive about the outlook for the UK, given what's happening globally. But Mrs. Thatcher would have been very much here, if she was here, talking about removing barriers, removing obstacles to growth. And I think what's positive is what's been done in Michael's department and generally is about this whole enabling environment. I think that's the key message.
Okay, and last word to our...
I'm going to be very quick. So all I'm going to say is that I agree long-term planning is really essential. There's a really good document outside called Looking to the Future of Growth, which has a plan for that on the tax side. So do pick it up, have a read, and get back to us with any comments or thoughts.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And it just remains for me to thank you for coming and ask you to thank our guests for their